If you've watched the movie Taken or seen human trafficking posters where a young girl is handcuffed with her mouth duct taped shut, laying on a cold concrete floor, it's likely that your knowledge on the subject stems from the mainstream media's representation of human trafficking. Usually a young girl who's kidnapped by an older male stranger and then against her will sold for sex. At Victim Services of Durham Region, we recognize that this typical idea of trafficking is often quite rare, and that there is a big missing gap between who is targeted for this crime and why. In the next few minutes, we will break down how domestic sex trafficking is a gendered phenomenon and ultimately an issue of equity, whereby the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals in society are at the greatest risk of being targeted by traffickers. In order to recruit someone into the sex trade, traffickers go through a detailed 5-step process that begins with them luring in a victim, grooming that victim for the trade, coercing and manipulating them to get them to take their first client, exploiting them, and then finally teaching their victim the same process for that victim to then go out and recruit in other individuals for the trafficker to exploit. Oftentimes, trafficking situations are relational, which means that over 90% of victims identify their trafficker to be an intimate partner like a boyfriend or girlfriend rather than a stranger that kidnapped them off the side of the road. When we move away from this idea of a trafficker as a hardened criminal or gang member, we can really begin to open room for understanding how just about anybody can use violence and manipulation to profit off of the exploitation of another person or group of people, especially if those people are vulnerable. When traffickers are looking for a potential victim to traffic, they usually have an ideal image of their victim in mind. Traffickers look for individuals who have significant vulnerabilities, both those that are visible and invisible. A vulnerability can be described as anything that can be perceived as a personal or social or economic shortcoming that increases a person's risk for exploitation, whereby that vulnerability is then leveraged in usage for malicious activity by the trafficker who profits off of exploiting that vulnerable person. So, for example, vulnerabilities might include traffickers scouting out individuals who are racialized, who identify as women or are part of the LGBTQ plus community, those who live with a disability, who experience poverty, who have a history of past abuse and trauma. The list is really endless. Oftentimes, traffickers choose to narrow in on victims who have more than one vulnerability, thus allowing the trafficker to then gain more grounds for them to exploit that individual on. Traffickers actually reap benefits off of a victim's really real and raw vulnerabilities. Individuals with significant vulnerabilities are often those that are marginalized by society, and it's important to really pause here and recognize that a person's vulnerabilities are of no fault of their own, but exist because of the oppressive society that we live in. Women, Indigenous people, Black people, people living in poverty are just some examples of those who are disproportionately represented in human trafficking statistics because they are often looked down upon in society and do not receive the same opportunities, privileges, and considerations as those that are deemed superior in society do. When we say that human trafficking is an equity issue, we are saying that because inequalities in our society continue to exist, those that are deemed inferior experience more barriers and struggles when it comes to things that should be really easy, like accessing healthcare or social services, having stable housing, having economic job opportunities, which then contributes to the development of the vulnerabilities that traffickers ultimately look for. We need to move the human trafficking conversation towards equity building for marginalized populations in order to reduce the barriers that individuals in society face that put them in a vulnerable position for exploitation in the first place. We need to dig deeper and get right to the root, which ultimately involves addressing topics such as racism, discrimination, the perpetration of gender-based violence, norms, and stereotypes that all work to contribute to a person's vulnerability. Traffickers only ever target vulnerable people as they know they can easily draw them in and play out on those vulnerabilities. Traffickers never target empowered people. They never even look in their direction. If vulnerabilities are addressed and recognized, the number of potential victims that are available for traffickers to exploit will then start to come down, which will in turn have an impact on decreasing amounts and accounts of human trafficking in our community. Taking time to really understand these root causes of exploitation and starting conversations that center around these topics in the community is a great way that we can start to gain movement towards this direction. Talking about our vulnerabilities, talking about societal oppression that drives those vulnerabilities and more will provide opportunities for individuals to feel seen and for their experiences to be validated, such that if a trafficker does try to come along and lure that person in, they will be empowered enough not to fall prey to their manipulation tactics. If you have a chance, take a moment today to really think about how you can contribute to the conversation and work towards promoting equity amongst our society to prevent at-risk individuals from being coerced into trafficking situations.